So here's the last part of my tutorial series on ropes, and in this tutorial we're going to have the player be able to attach to the rope, swing on the rope, climb up and down the rope. So if you haven't watched my first two videos on the rope and crank creations, I will put them in the description below, and they are required to follow before you can get to this step. So keep that in mind. Okay, so from the last tutorial we have this player object, and I'm just going to add a couple things to the player so that our script will work. So we first need to add a hinge joint 2D, and that will automatically add a rigid body 2D as well. I'm going to freeze the rotation in the Z-axis, and I'm going to turn off the hinge joint 2D. I'm going to disable auto configure connect and put the connected anchor at 0, 0. Next, I'm going to just put a sprite on here so that we can see the player. Okay, that should be all we need. Now I'm going to do a couple more things. I just went through the ropes that we made in the last tutorial, and I needed to make sure that the hooks all had the freeze rotation Z checked in the rigid body. So just go through and make sure your hooks are all checked there. And then I also had to go into the rope segment prefabs that we've made in the past tutorial. I selected them all and set them to the tag rope. So this will make sure that when the player collides with it, it'll know it's a rope. And all of these box colliders are triggers on all of the rope segments. Okay, so I'm going to open up the player script. So there's a couple things that I've added to this script so that we can have the player climb up and down the rope and swing on the rope. So I've added all of these to be attributes of this class. We have a reference to the rigid body 2D of the player and the hinge joint 2D component of the player. I've set a push force, so this is the force at which the player will swing on. You can adjust this, but I've set it to 10, and that's a public float, so we can adjust it in the inspector. I have a bool to determine whether or not the player is currently attached to a rope, so this will help us know whether or not we need to attach or detach. I have the transform of the object that the player is attached to, and this will actually hold the entire rope parent transform so we know which rope it's on. And then a game object called disregard, and so this is basically going to contain the rope object that we are attached to, so that when we detach from the rope, it won't automatically reattach. So it basically disregards the rope that we're currently attached to, so that it won't reattach to it. So in the awake function, I just grab the two components and set them here for the rigid body and the hinge joint. And then in the update function, I call this new function that I've made called check keyboard inputs, and that is right here. So for the keyboard controls, I have A and left arrow both being the swing left on rope button, and then D or the right arrow are going to swing right, spacebar to detach, and W and S or up and down to climb up and down the rope. So simply in this function, we just check if it's A or left, and if we're attached, then we'll swing. This will make sure that when you detach from the rope, that you're not still flying through the air with a push force. So it's more realistic that you're just moving with the force that you had when you were attached to the rope and then free falling in the air. So that's what this and this both do for the left and right. So basically it just adds a relative force to the rigid body, and so I just added in the direction that you're moving multiplied by whatever push force we put at the top. And then for W and up and S and down, it'll slide you up or down the rope. I use a positive and negative integer in the slide function to determine the direction. And I also make sure that we're attached in this function. Basically keeping attached here, keeping the check for attached in all of these Conditionals allows you to add more controls for if you want the player to be able to walk on the ground. You can use the same controls and have them do different things based on whether or not the player is actually attached to something. And then finally, if spacebar is pressed, then we detach. So I have to create the slide function and the detach function and the attach function, which are all down here. Actually, before I go through these, I'm just going to go through the onTriggerEnter function, because this is basically what happens when the player collides with a rope object. So basically, since we have the rope set to a trigger, if the player collides with it and we're not attached to a current rope, meaning that if you're swinging, you're not going to, if you hit another rope while you're swinging on one rope, you're not going to attach to the other rope. So we check if it's not attached, and if the object that we collide with is tagged rope, like we just tagged the segments before as a rope, and we're not currently attached to that same rope, then we check if disregard is null or whatever we're attaching to isn't disregard, so it's not the rope we just left. Then we will attach to whatever the game object is that we collided with. So we pass the rigid body into the attach function. So it just does a bunch of checks basically here. If it's a rope, if it's not what we're already on, and if it's not what we just left, then it will attach. So in the attach function, let's see what we have here. So it takes in the rigid body 2D that I called rope bone. So it gets the rope segment component of the rope segment that we attached to. Since we know our rope is composed of lots of different rope segments, we can attach to one specific rope segment. So it gets that rope segment and sets this variable is player attached to true. Now we don't have this yet in the rope segment, but it's just a Boolean that I've added in the rope segment class here. Bool is player attached. I didn't do anything else in this class. So if you want to go into your rope segment class and add that, that will make sure we can use this in the future. After we tell the rope segment that a player is attached to it, then we can set the connected body of the hinge joint of this player to whatever we just collided with. And since we turned off the hinge joint at the beginning when we created the player, now we can turn it on and set the enable to true. So that means now the hinge will be in effect and we have a connected body that this is connected to. Then we set attached to true. Then we set attached to our attached to variable to be the parent of whatever rope segment we're in, so we know what whole rope we're attached to, not just the segment specifically. Then in our detach function, it's pretty much the reverse of everything we do in the attached. So we set is player attached to whatever that connected body, whatever that object that we're connected to is. We set its rope segments variable is player attached to false. So we tell that rope segment we're not attached to you anymore. We set attached to false, and we disable the hinge joint entirely and set the connected body to null. Now I just want to show you, if we have the hinge joint here turned on, the player ends up just getting attached to wherever that hinge joint is. So that's why we have to keep disabling it when we're not attached, because the player won't actually move. It's just attached to some invisible wall. So by disabling it, now we can free fall. So every time we attach to something, we enable it, and then we make sure it's attached to the rope. And then when it detaches from the rope, we turn it off entirely so it won't just stick to the wall. Okay, so that's our attach and detach functions. Next up is the sliding up and down the rope. So first we store whatever rope segment we are currently connected to in this variable we call myConnection. We have that stored in the connected body attribute of the hinge joint component, so we can just simply grab the game object that's in there as rope segment class and set it as myConnection. And then we create a new seg object, which is just a game object, which will be the new segment that we move toward. So since we're taking the integer value of a direction, positive direction is moving up and negative direction is moving down. So if there's a positive direction and there is actually a rope segment connected above the one we are currently on, then we can move up. So we also check here if the one we're connected above has the component rope segment. So that means we won't accidentally connect to the hook, because the hook is technically a hinge joint as well. We could connect to it as a player, but we want to just stick to connecting to rope segments. So basically, is there something above, and is whatever is above it an actual rope segment? If so, then we're going to set the new segment to the object that is connected above the one we're on. And then if we're moving down, basically we only need to check if it's connected below. Because only rope segments will be connected below, we don't have to do the same check. There's not going to be anything that isn't a rope segment connected below a rope segment. So we just need to check if there is a segment there, and if so, then we'll set the new segment to whatever is connected below. So that's how we move up and down. And then all we got to do is change the position of the player to be whatever the position of that new segment is. We have to tell the segment that we were on before that we are no longer attached to it. So we set is player attached of the current connection to false. We set is player attached to the new rope segment to true. And then we simply change the connected body of the player to be the rigid body of the new segment that we just attached to. So now we're hooked onto the new segment. This does create a bit of a choppy movement by just setting the transform position like this. If you want, you could do a lerp to slide the player into that direction. But I find that this was easiest to make sure that the anchor of the player was connecting properly with the transform pivot point of the rope segment. I was getting kind of weird results when I tried to move up and down where it wasn't connected in the right anchor point. So you might have to fiddle with that in order to get a smoother movement up and down if that's what you're looking for. And so that's it for the player script. One more thing that we're going to do is just adjust one of the rope functions to make sure that the player doesn't get kicked off the rope when we try to shorten it. So because the rope can go up and down, if the player is on the top rope segment and then we delete it by moving it up, we have to make sure we can move the player down to the next rope segment so that the player doesn't just get stuck. So that's all we need to do in our rope script. So all I've added in this script was this player reference so that we could tell the player to slide down. And in the remove link function, I basically check that rope segment, the one we were about to remove. I check if the player is attached to it. So that's why we have this is player attached variable that we've been using. It's so that we could check it here. So if the player is attached to the rope segment that we're trying to remove, then we simply slide the player down one rope. And it's that simple. So that's just how we can make sure the player doesn't get stuck. Okay, so let's give this a test. I'm going to just move the player to be right above one of the ropes here so that it'll fall, and when it falls it'll hit the rope and connect with it. So let's give it a whirl. Good start. Well, it looks like I forgot to add a collider to the player. So I'm just going to add a simple polygon collider. And so now we can actually tell when we collide with the rope. And just set that to is trigger. And now it should work. There we go. So we've connected to the top of the rope. We can see that it's attached to rope 2. As I said, it attaches to the parent rope, so we know the full rope that it's on. If I press S, then we can move down, W to move up, so that's good. And then I hold D and S to swing back and forth, gain a little bit of momentum. And then spacebar to detach, and it's just attached now to this rope. I can move down, I can move up, I can shorten the rope a little bit. That's good. This is the case where now we're at the top of the rope and I want to move up. See, it shifts the player down and then deletes that segment, so that's good. Can swing on this one. And detach. It's, you know what, it could use a little bit of tweaking, but I think it's looking pretty good. So that's pretty much it for my attach, detach, swing, climb part of this tutorial series, and that means that's it for the entire series. So thank you so much for watching. I'd love it if you would share any rope related things you make with these tutorials with me. I'm easy to find on Twitter, so you can just message me or @ me with whatever you make. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. And until then, I hope to see you again on my channel. I post about game dev stuff every week, so I hope to see you soon. And thank you so much for watching. Okay, bye everyone.